Sydney's streets don't announce danger. It arrives quietly, hides behind routines, and strikes when life feels ordinary. This story begins in that silence, not with sirens, but with a name already circulating in places most people never see. Suman Mokhtarian wasn't a crime figure. He wasn't a gang leader. He was a former UFC fighter and coach whose life unfolded in gyms, not back alleys. But somewhere beyond the training mats, a decision had already been made. 18 months before his death, that decision revealed itself in gunfire outside a Sydney gym. He lived, and that survival changed everything. Because in the underworld, surviving a warning doesn't erase the threat, it confirms it. This isn't just a story about violence, it's about how organized crime identifies targets, waits patiently, and enforces outcomes in plain sight. Like the video, subscribe to the channel for more videos, and let's begin with how his name ended up on the list. Before he was ever associated with danger, Suman Mokhtarian was known for something else entirely: discipline. At 33 years old, he was a former professional mixed martial artist whose life revolved around structure, routine, and control. His reputation in Sydney's West wasn't built on intimidation or bravado, but on coaching, consistency, and respect earned the hard way. Mokhtarian fought his way through Australia's MMA circuit, building an 8-2 professional record and earning a shot at the sport's highest level. He appeared on The Ultimate Fighter, undefeated, and stepped into the UFC octagon twice between 2018 and 2019. The results didn't go his way, but in a sport where survival itself earns respect, his toughness did not go unnoticed. Fighters knew his name. Coaches trusted him. When his fighting career ended, he stayed exactly where he felt safest: the gym. As a coach at Australian top team in Sydney, Mokhtarian became a mentor to young athletes chasing the same dream he once lived. To them, he wasn't a headline or a statistic. He was proof that discipline could change a life. What no one saw was the shift happening beyond the gym doors. Long before the public knew his name, whispers had started circulating in darker circles. Intelligence later revealed that more than 18 months before his death, Mokhtarian had already been identified as a target, not because he was a fighter, but because someone believed he had crossed the wrong people. That belief turned violent in February 2024. Outside his Wentworthville gym, a gunman disguised as a delivery rider pulled up and opened fire. Bullets tore into the space where students trained. Mokhtarian survived, but survival came with a message. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. From that moment on, Mokhtarian wasn't just coaching fighters. He was living under a sentence that hadn't yet been carried out, and the people behind it were patient. Sydney's underworld doesn't operate in chaos. It runs on structure, loyalty, fear, and consequences. And long before the public learned Suman Mokhtarian was living under threat, one name kept surfacing behind the scenes: the Alameddin crime network. This was no loose street gang. The Alameddins had spent years carving out power across Western Sydney, building a reputation that travelled faster than any warning. Their operations stretched deep into drug trafficking, intimidation rackets, and violent enforcement, the kind of network where money, loyalty, and fear moved together. At its peak, the syndicate was believed to be generating around $1 million every single week from drug distribution alone. That level of cash doesn't just buy influence, it buys silence, weapons, and people willing to act. Their rise was written in blood. Between 2020 and 2022, Sydney was rattled by a brutal underworld feud involving the Alameddins and rival crime families. Drive-by shootings lit up suburban streets, homes were sprayed with bullets, cars were torched. The violence didn't stay contained within criminal circles, it spilled into public spaces, placing ordinary families in the crossfire and turning quiet suburbs into crime scenes overnight. What made the Alameddins especially feared wasn't just violence, it was retaliation. Slights weren't ignored, disputes weren't negotiated away, they were answered, often publicly, to send a message that crossed the entire criminal ecosystem. Reputation mattered, and anyone believed to threaten profit or status risked being made an example of. By 2025, the scale of this violence forced an unprecedented response. A major task force was assembled, combining multiple investigations into shootings, arson attacks, kidnappings, and organized crime figures linked to syndicates like the Alameddins. It was an admission of how deeply entrenched these networks had become. Inside that world of money, revenge, and calculated brutality, Mokhtarian's name didn't surface by accident. It surfaced because someone decided he belonged on a list. And once a name is written there, it rarely gets erased. Next, let's rewind to the moment that List nearly claimed him for the first time. The moment everything changed didn't arrive quietly. It arrived on a weekday morning in February 2024 outside a gym that was supposed to be a place of discipline and safety. Suman Mokhtarian was standing near the entrance of his Wentworthville training facility when a rider rolled in, helmet on, delivery bag visible, nothing that looked out of place. Then the scooter stopped, and the gun came out. Multiple shots were fired in seconds. Concrete shattered. Panic exploded inside the gym as fighters and students scrambled for cover. Mokhtarian ran, not as a professional athlete, but as a man trying to stay alive, diving inside just in time to escape bullets that were meant to end his story right there. No argument, no warning, just execution-style intent in broad daylight. The escape didn't mean the danger passed. Within hours, the attack was already being treated as something far more serious than street violence. Two young men, just 19 and 20 years old, were later charged over the attempted killing. Not seasoned bosses, not decision makers, the kind of age you expect on the street level. Foot soldiers, the people sent when someone higher up wants distance from the trigger. The scooter used in the shooting didn't last long. It was found burned out nearby, reduced to ash in a familiar underworld cleanup ritual. Vehicles get torched when the message is meant to be clean and the trail is meant to end. What followed was silence on the surface and pressure underneath. Mokhtarian kept training, kept coaching, but the tension was impossible to miss. By April 2025, it had escalated to the point where an MMA event he was scheduled to attend was cancelled entirely over fears another attempt could unfold in public. The risk was no longer just to him. It was to anyone standing nearby. Privately, he knew what it meant. Messages sent to people close to him hinted at a man who understood the reality of being hunted. The February ambush wasn't a mistake. It wasn't random. It was a warning shot, and in the underworld, warnings are rarely the final act. And now, let's examine what could provoke a vendetta serious enough to demand a second attempt. In the underworld, nothing sparks violence faster than missing product. Respect can be negotiated, territory can be shared, but when drugs disappear, the response is ruthless. Behind the scenes of Suman Mokhtarian's final months, one phrase kept surfacing in whispered conversations and intelligence briefings: a drug rip. A rip isn't just theft, it's a declaration of war. In criminal networks built on fear and cash flow, losing a major consignment doesn't just cost money, it weakens authority. For a syndicate believed to have generated around $1 million a week from drug distribution at its peak, any loss carries consequences that ripple outward. Someone has to answer for it. Someone has to be made an example. The anger didn't explode immediately. It brewed. Weeks turned into months, and resentment hardened into planning. Mokhtarian wasn't alleged to be a crime boss or a dealer, but his name became linked, fairly or not, to the dispute. In that world, association alone can be enough. Guilt doesn't need proof, it needs belief. Once that belief takes hold, the machinery of retaliation starts moving. Surveillance. Messages passed quietly. Decisions made far away from the street. When the February 2024 ambush failed, it wasn't seen as the end. It was seen as unfinished business. A warning that didn't land. A mistake that needed correcting. What makes these vendettas so dangerous is patience. This wasn't impulsive rage. It was cold accounting. Every delay allowed anger to ferment, turning frustration into resolve. Cancelling public appearances. Changing routines. Living cautiously. None of it erased the debt written in the syndicate's ledger. In the underworld, money and reputation are inseparable. Losing drugs weakens profit, letting it slide weakens fear. And fear is currency. Once fear starts to fade, violence restores it, publicly, decisively, and without apology. By the time Mokhtarian realized the threat hadn't passed, the decision had already been made somewhere beyond his reach. The failed hit didn't close the chapter. It merely confirmed that someone believed the balance still needed to be settled. And when the underworld decides a debt must be paid, it rarely accepts anything less than blood. Now, let's move to the day that long-building retaliation finally came due. By 8th October 2024, the tension that had followed Suman Mokhtarian for nearly 2 years finally reached its end. Just after 6 p.m, as daylight still hung over Sydney's northwest, Mokhtarian stepped onto a quiet stretch near Anna Luke Street in Riverstone, a place defined by family homes, parked cars, and evening routines. It should have been uneventful. It wasn't. Shots cut through the street without warning. Not a scuffle. not an argument. A rapid, deliberate burst of gunfire. Mokhtarian was hit in the upper body and collapsed where he stood. The attack was over almost as quickly as it began. By the time help arrived, there was nothing left to save. A man who had survived cage fights, knockdowns, and years of punishment in professional combat was gone in seconds. The violence rippled outward. Neighbours froze as the sound echoed between houses. A child was playing nearby and had to be dragged indoors as panic took over. This wasn't a dark alley or an industrial backstreet. It was suburbia, interrupted by execution-style precision. What followed made it unmistakably organised. Within minutes, attention shifted to nearby streets, where two vehicles were found burning. A red Audi and a white van. Fire swallowed them completely, erasing fingerprints, DNA, and any easy trail. It was a familiar tactic, one used to sever the link between shooters and the scene, turning a single killing into a maze of evidence. The area became a patchwork of crime scenes. Roads were sealed. Police searched for multiple offenders believed to have fled using different vehicles. Residents stood behind tape, watching the reality sink in. This wasn't random violence. It was planned, timed, and carried out with confidence. For Mokhtarian, the irony was brutal. His life had been shaped by controlled combat, rules, and discipline. This final fight had none of that. No referee, no bell. Just a decision made elsewhere and enforced without hesitation. The warning shot in 2024 had become a final statement in 2025. And with it, Sydney was left confronting how easily organised crime can step out of the shadows and into the middle of an ordinary street. Next, let's step back to understand how Sydney's long history of underworld violence made moments like this possible. What happened to Suman Mokhtarian didn't come out of nowhere. It came out of history. Sydney has been rehearsing this kind of violence for nearly 100 years. Only the weapons and the players have changed. In the 1920s and 1930s, the city's underworld didn't rely on guns. Firearms were restricted, so criminals adapted. Razor blades became the weapon of choice, and public slashing attacks turned streets and pubs into battlegrounds. Rival factions led by figures like Tilly Devine and Kate Lee fought openly for control of vice, protection rackets, and territory. Violence was intimate, brutal, and deliberately public, designed to send a message without saying a word. That culture never disappeared. It evolved. By 1984, guns had replaced blades, and the stakes had multiplied. A Father's Day confrontation between the Comanchero Motorcycle Club and the Bandidos Motorcycle Club erupted into the Milpera massacre. 7 people were killed, 28 more were wounded. A suburban parking lot became a war zone, and Australia was forced to confront how organised crime had outgrown the shadows. The late 1990s and 2000s brought another shift. Methamphetamine flooded the streets and profits exploded. Outlaw motorcycle gangs and emerging syndicates fought over supply lines, nightclub security, and distribution routes. Violence moved into airports, shopping strips, and entertainment precincts. Public places were no longer off limits. By the 2010s and 2020s, Sydney's underworld had fractured into layered networks. Bikie clubs, family-based syndicates, street crews, and drug importation rings. Feuds became longer, quieter, and more calculated. Arson attacks, drive-by shootings, and contract killings became tools of enforcement rather than acts of rage. That history matters. It explains why retaliation is expected, not shocking. Why warnings escalate instead of fade, and why a dispute doesn't end with survival. It ends when someone is removed. Mokhtarian's death wasn't an outlier. It was the latest expression of a city where organised crime has learned, generation by generation, how to strike harder, cleaner, and closer to home. Next, let's examine the modern crime figures and gangs now carrying this legacy forward. Sydney's underworld doesn't answer to one kingpin. It functions like a pressure system, multiple forces colliding, separating, and violently correcting one another. Beneath the surface, dozens of organised groups coexist in a fragile balance. And when that balance breaks, the consequences are public and brutal. At the core of that ecosystem sit outlaw motorcycle gangs, a national presence with around 35 active clubs and roughly 3,500 patch members across Australia. In Sydney alone, the so-called Big Six, the Hells Angels, Comanchero Motorcycle Club, Rebels Motorcycle Club, Bandidos Motorcycle Club, Mongols Motorcycle Club and Finks Motorcycle Club have long histories tied to drug distribution, intimidation, and armed confrontations. These aren't fringe players. They control territory, enforce debts, and protect supply lines. Some clubs grew larger than others. The Rebels, at one point Australia's biggest bikie organisation, expanded to more than 70 chapters and over 1,000 members nationwide, giving them reach that stretched far beyond Sydney. With size came influence and conflict. Turf disputes didn't stay contained. They spilled into public venues, highways, and neighbourhood streets. Alongside bickies, family-based crime groups added another volatile layer. Crews like Brothers for Life rose from tight-knit street origins into powerful syndicates, becoming central players in violent feuds that rattled Sydney suburbs for years. Their clashes weren't symbolic, they were measured in shootings, arsons, and bodies. Then came the new generation. Groups like KVT evolved rapidly, transforming from street crews into serious drug-running operations almost overnight. These newer syndicates didn't wait decades to build reputations. They forced recognition through speed and violence. By 2025, the scale of the problem was undeniable. Coordinated crackdowns across New South Wales and Victoria resulted in 29 arrests and nearly 140 charges tied to drugs and firearms in a single operation. It was proof that this wasn't isolated crime. It was an entrenched system. In that environment, retaliation isn't emotional, it's procedural. Mokhtarian's killing didn't occur in a vacuum. It happened in a city where rivalries overlap, alliances shift, and violence is a language everyone understands. And now it's time to confront the real cost of this world and who ultimately pays the price. When the gunfire fades and the street reopens, the damage doesn't disappear. It spreads. Sydney's underworld violence leaves scars far deeper than a single crime scene, and the numbers behind it are as chilling as the stories themselves. Serious and organised crime now costs Australia tens of billions of dollars every year, with recent estimates placing the figure between $68.7 billion and $82.3 billion annually. Broken down, that burden works out to more than $2,500 for every person in the country. A hidden tax paid in fear, disruption, and lost safety. It's built from drug trafficking, weapons circulation, extortion, cybercrime, and violence that bleeds into everyday life. Every gang war demands a response. Specialist task forces, surveillance teams, armed patrols, prosecutions that drag on for years. Billions are poured into prevention and enforcement just to keep pace with networks that adapt faster than laws can be written. But the deepest damage isn't financial, it's psychological. Suburbs touched by organised crime change overnight. Streets empty earlier. Neighbours stop lingering outside. The sense of normal life quietly erodes, replaced by caution and unease. People who had nothing to do with the underworld become unwilling participants, living beside crime scenes and reading their own street names in headlines. For law enforcement, the challenge grows heavier every year. Modern syndicates are layered, mobile, and resilient. When one group is disrupted, another fills the gap. Arrests don't end conflicts. They often reshuffle them. Each crackdown is followed by retaliation, and each retaliation risks pulling more innocent people into the blast radius. Cases like Suman Mokhtarian's death expose a brutal truth. Organised crime no longer hides at the edges of society. It moves through suburbs, gyms, and footpaths, places meant to be safe. And as long as money, drugs, and power remain intertwined, the cost will keep rising. This story isn't just about who was targeted. It's about what happens when crime steps fully into the open and how much a city is forced to pay for it. In the end, Suman Mokhtarian's story forces an uncomfortable question into the open. How does a professional athlete end up trapped in a world ruled by retaliation and silence? How many others are living under similar threats that never make headlines until it's too late? This case wasn't just about one man. It exposed how organised crime bleeds into everyday suburbs, turning ordinary streets into battlegrounds and routine lives into collateral damage. The warning signs were there, the violence was escalating, and yet the outcome still arrived with shocking finality. What do you think could have stopped this from ending the way it did? And do you believe Sydney's underworld violence is getting harder to contain? Comment your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe to the channel for more videos.